Welcome back to Carneades.org. Today we're going to be continuing with our series, How to Write a Philosophy Paper, which we're doing all October long. In this video, we're looking at reinterpreting a historical argument. So, the history of philosophy is a subdiscipline of philosophy, and history of philosophy papers look a bit different from your standard philosophy papers. They focus is generally on interpreting or modernizing the arguments as opposed to creating new arguments or actively engaging with them. It's not to say that these practices don't exist at all in the history of philosophy, but rather that more time and effort is spent on interpretation and understanding of the original philosopher's point than providing new objections to the arguments. The creativity in such papers comes in new interpretations of classic arguments. Instead of offering a new argument to defend Aristotle, you might offer a new way that we could understand him better based on the works of his contemporaries, or a new translation of a particular passage, or a better modern equivalent of a key term, like eudaimonia. There are lots of different ways to take on history of philosophy papers, which look in some ways different from standard philosophy papers because they're focused on interpreting the argument in new ways or understanding the argument in new ways based on what would have happened in history, as opposed to coming up with your new argument out of nowhere. These papers follow a similar structure of summarizing previous literature, but instead focus on previous interpretations of the term, argument, thesis, theory, and these things. Greater effort is made to include what secondary sources have said, particularly when those secondary sources are contemporaneous to the original source, especially when you're dealing with something that's pretty far back in history. What Aristotle's contemporaries may have said about him and his arguments is probably going to be a closer interpretation to what he was actually talking about, because they're living in the same culture, experiencing the same things, than someone that's writing a couple centuries later. Though those may be interesting things to incorporate in if those later interpretations have a life of their own and have a large following. As with other philosophy papers, the shorter your paper, the less your individual contribution needs to be. A shorter paper in the history of philosophy can mostly focus on summarizing what others have said about a particular passage or argument from history. However, longer papers generally include your particular contribution to the discussion. What have other sources gotten wrong about what a famous philosopher meant? What passage has always perplexed philosophers, but with a new interpretation might now make sense? What is a new way of understanding this extremely critical word in ancient Greek or particular term that's used a lot in philosophy that people haven't fully understood or mapped onto a modern concept yet? The principle of charity is more important than ever in such works. When a famous philosopher says something that appears to be contradictory, particularly one that's coming out of antiquity, it's easy to dismiss it as a mistake. The more interesting task, and it's quite possible that there are a lot of mistakes in these works, but the more interesting task here, and the more academically challenging one, is to attempt to make this claim consistent with the rest of their work, or with the rest of their work from that period, if it's a philosopher that wrote a lot or seems to have had different opinions at different times. Or with the work of their contemporaries, and in doing so, perhaps come to a better understanding of their true position, or just a substantive position that can be defended, even if deep down you think that they were just wrong. The interesting task here is to say, how can I strengthen this argument, and how can I be as charitable as possible, as opposed to just getting a gotcha moment of, wow, Aristotle had some weird views about science, so we don't need to listen to anything he had to say. Definitions are particularly important in papers like this because meanings of words change, and what Aristotle, I seem to be using Aristotle as an example here a lot, what Aristotle meant by art and what we mean by it now are very different things. And so when Aristotle says nature imitates art, he doesn't exactly mean what we mean today. Therefore, it's important for both you to understand what's going on in the historical text, but also to make sure you provide that context for whoever is reading or interpreting your paper. Because if a modern person, a standard modern academic, wouldn't have a sense of what the ancient Greeks meant by techne or eudaimonia, then you need to provide them that context if it's central to what you're talking about in your paper. So definitions are particularly important for anything that's dealing with philosophy coming out of antiquity. So the best way to get a sense of what good history of philosophy looks like is to read secondary sources for particularly controversial or confusing figures in philosophy and see how they document the various potential interpretations of a particular passage, perceived contradictions, and so on. So while doing philosophy may be benefited by reading a lot of primary sources that are actively doing that, history of philosophy is often benefited by reading some of those secondary sources and seeing how they wrestle with some of those issues of what did Descartes, we'll use someone other than Aristotle, what did Descartes really mean when he said this? What is he implying? Next up, we're going to look at summarizing a debate, which is a step up from summarizing just an argument. In our series on how to write a philosophy paper, we're doing a new video twice a week, which is wild for the whole month of October. Watch this video and more here at Carneades.org, and stay skeptical, everybody.